Good evening. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for the program this evening. My name is Catherine Magana, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The SAB is a bipartisan group, and as a member of the SAB, I get access to many great opportunities by being involved with the Institute. If you are a KU student and are interested in joining, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. For this evening's event, if you would like to know more about our guests, the event itself, upcoming Institute events, and more, you can download a printable handout. The link is in the event description below. At the end of this evening's event, we will have time for you to ask questions of our guests. Please email your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important topics and questions. Please phrase your questions with these in mind. And now, please join me in welcoming our director, Audrey Coleman.
Thank you, Catherine, for that warm welcome. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As Catherine mentioned, I'm Audrey Coleman. I'm director of the Dole Institute of Politics here at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas. And we're so excited you could be with us this evening as we kick off our spring 2022 programming season with this virtual installment, the first installment of our presidential lecture series this spring, Military Veterans in the Oval Office. I'm proud that our program partners for this series this year include the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum and the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library, Museum, and Boyhood Home. And we'll look forward to visiting with leaders from those fine institutions in subsequent installments of this series. This evening, though, I'm so proud to introduce to you Richard Norton Smith, presidential historian, biographer, and founding director of the Dole Institute. Richard, I would say, with this audience, you probably need no introduction. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, hey, listen, thank you very much. And it's an honor to share the stage with the new director of the Dole Institute. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much.
Great step forward, I think.
I appreciate it, and I wanted to congratulate you too. I don't know if you remember, Richard, but it was 20 years ago in 2002 that you kicked off the Dole Institute's presidential lecture series in the fall over at the Lead Center before the Dole Institute as we know it was even built and dedicated. So congratulations to you on this 20-year commemoration of the presidential lecture series.
Well, thanks again. I remember it vividly. David McCullough packing the Lead Center, and I suspect we probably could have filled it twice over.
Well, we'll look forward to having you back in person one of these days, for sure. So, Richard, our series is about, this season is about the relationship of military service and presidential leadership. And would you start by giving us a little bit of background as a presidential historian? Has this subject been discussed, been treated by presidential historians very much? And if so, how have they characterized the relationship between military service and presidential leadership?
Well, it's a very large question, and certainly one deserving of the kind of attention that the next several programs will give. It has, in fact, been something discussed for as long as there's been an American presidency. Lest we forget, our first and some would say our greatest president was a military man. And interesting enough, this is also a great way to look at the even larger question of how presidential reputations tend to evolve over time, how each generation, in effect, takes the perhaps same information and looks at it through a different lens. For a long time, quite frankly, there was something of a bias against military men as American presidents. And there were a number of factors at work there. Ironically, the two most recent generals who tended to call forth, if you will, to evoke the harshest criticism from many academics in particular were Dwight Eisenhower and Ulysses Grant, who were also two presidents who, as any C-SPAN viewer knows, have enjoyed a real renaissance in recent years. Ike, really beginning in the 1970s, and is now widely regarded as one of America's most successful presidents. Grant, a less dramatic rise, but nevertheless dramatic for most of our history, for most of the century and a half since Grant left office. He was routinely regarded as being at or near the bottom of American presidents. And in both cases, the criticisms were much the same. They were criticized as well-meaning, honest, men of personal integrity, but men who did not have the proper experience and above all, the kind of instinctive political judgment that this most political of jobs demands. It's not just Ike and Grant. If you look at that long post-Civil War parade of bearded nonentities, at least how they were seen, again, until recently, put down along with the Gilded Age itself. I mean, who can remember what Rutherford B. Hayes did as president, or Chester Arthur, or Benjamin Harrison? The one thing they had in common was they all fought in the Civil War. Most of them were generals in the Civil War, some political and some truly military. Before the Civil War, you had Andrew Jackson, someone who, for most of our history, was seen as certainly one of the most consequential of American presidents, and yet his reputation has taken a nosedive in recent years, in part because of his, if you will, militaristic or even dictatorial tendencies, as some see them, even more because of his attitudes about race. He was, of course, a Southern slave owner, and toward the American Indian. So it's a mixed bag, and if you look across the field, you'll see just how dynamic presidential reputations are. Grant, Eisenhower, even the Gilded Age presidents are getting a fresh, more sympathetic look than in the past. But broadly speaking, I would say for most of our recent history, there has been a prejudice, if you will, against the military man as president, precisely because he, it was alleged, lacked the training or the temperament. Generals are accustomed to giving orders. Presidents, by and large, discover, perhaps to their dismay, that they can give orders, but Congress is not likely to carry them out.
So for our first president, who was, before he was president, obviously was General George Washington, a commanding general of the Revolutionary Army. You know, what was his relationship? How did he, at the close of the war, was he eager to become president? What did he see for his next, you know, his path, and how did he translate what he learned during the war into the executive office?
Well, that's a great question, and a number of books have been written in an attempt to begin to answer that question. Washington, everything about Washington is unique. Of course, he was the first. He established the precedents. He set the guidelines for most of our history. His example precluded, for example, the idea of a president running for a third term, and indeed only one has managed the trick. What we tend to forget is Washington was president for 8 years, but he was the nearest thing to a president that we had for 16 years, including the 8 years of the American Revolution, the war and its immediate aftermath. He, in effect, filled the executive role. He performed the inspirational function that a head of state would be assigned. And he was very close to being a head of government, to the extent that there was a national government. Washington learned how to be president dealing with Congress, dealing often with foreign affairs, with foreigners who either came here to assist in training and preparing and professionalizing his army, or in fact dealing with foreign diplomats who were establishing relations with this experiment called the United States. So Washington had a vast amount of political as well as military training. In fact, you can really think about Washington as the first great political general, a title that many people have applied to Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, if you think of Eisenhower, if nothing else, the fact that Eisenhower could work with in harmony and get the best out of as disparate a group of egos as Churchill, de Gaulle, Montgomery, Patton, and the list goes on. That calls for a remarkable degree of political intuition. Well, Washington had the same quality. So although Washington went to his grave convincing everyone that he was no politician, ironically, part of his genius as a politician was the very ability he had to appear to be non-political. Because you stop to think about it, this country in 1789 was a scrap of parchment. The Constitution had very little legitimacy. It had no long tradition behind it, no instinctive loyalty from the American people. What it had was George Washington. Washington's example, Washington's character, and Washington's, I would say, political instincts. And all of those that he brought to bear. He's the only president, for example, that chose the entire Supreme Court. And he was very careful, whether picking judges or populating a cabinet, something, by the way, that that he invented. The Constitution says nothing about it. He understood that this disparate group of former squabbling colonies had to, over time, be welded together into something approaching a unified nation. And he was the man to do it. He didn't want to be president. And in fact, the job would have been very, very different indeed had he had his desire. He originally thought that he could leave halfway through the first term. And just stop to think what would happen if he had done that. It might very well become a kind of prime minister and Congress a kind of parliament. Washington's prestige, Washington's credibility was so immense, it towered over that of any of his contemporaries, that the ultimate reason why, I think, the Constitution was adopted, the ultimate reason why we have a United States of America as we do, and a presidency that we have, is because George Washington, at the end of the Revolution, voluntarily walked away from power, from supreme power. As has been said a million times, he could have been king, but he walked away from power. And guess what? He did it again at the end of his second term as president. And it led the poet Robert Frost to say George Washington was one of the few men in recorded history who walked away from power. That genius for renunciation put restraints upon the American government and upon the American executive, which have been debated, sometimes challenged, but basically accepted and legalized ever since.
Most presidents, the vast majority of presidents after General Washington in the 19th century had some form of military experience. Did Americans at the time, did voters at the time, did presidential hopefuls think to trade on their military experience or characterize that as something valuable or unique, or that would give them some kind of special skill as president of the United States? Or is that something just a given? And how did Americans respond to that?
Well, sure. First of all, Washington, of course, was sui generis, but in many ways he he set a pattern. Andrew Jackson was, after Washington, probably the dominant figure of the 19th century until Lincoln, who, of course, although he had a scanty military record, as he was the first to point out, would become the ultimate wartime president. What happened as a result of the Civil War is the reason why, for the rest of the century, almost every president had a direct connection to the war. There's a reason why so many generals, would-be generals, served in the presidential office. For one thing, the war redefined the country. It was the shaping, defining experience for almost every American, North and South, and it continued to shape their lives, the aftermath of the war, Reconstruction and its aftermath for the rest of the century. But there's another very practical political reason, and that is stop and think of all of those hundreds of thousands, indeed millions, of men, North and South, whose defining experience in their life was the wearing of their country's uniform, the being thrown together with people from all over the country who they never would have met, of seeing a country they never would have seen, and experiencing different parts of the country that they never would have encountered. In other words, the war redefined the country, and it redefined in many ways life in the country, and it bequeathed to the political process perhaps the biggest, most influential lobbying group in American history, the Grand Army of the Republic. Hundreds of thousands of politically active veterans who, for the rest of the century, and indeed into the 20th century, would be a dominant force, not only, by the way, in every year's federal budget, because of very generous benefits that were promised to veterans of the war, whether or not, by the way, they had been injured or wounded in the war. So there was a huge, in effect, power block that was pressing for the economic interests of the veterans, but also refighting, if you will, old political battles. The battle over race, and the rights of the freedman, which would preoccupy Americans well into the, say, 1870s. And whether it was U.S. Grant, on the one hand, who had fought, in effect, a war to free the slave, or Benjamin Harrison, who as late as the late 1880s tried against great odds and without success to ensure the voting rights for Black Americans. The war and the issues that led to the war continued to shape American politics and the presidency for the lifespan of most of the war's veterans.
The presidents of the the 19th century period themselves, can you give us any examples or notable examples of their reflections or their own opinions on their experience, either on the battlefield or in military leadership?
Well, it's interesting, kind of an extension of what we've just been about. For a long time, one reason why historians tended to look down on generals as presidents is because of the blatant cynicism with which one party, in particular the Whig Party, exploited military appeal. There were two Whig presidents elected. They were both generals, neither of whom was particularly active politically. Remember William Henry Harrison in 1840, and then Zachary Taylor 8 years later. And in both cases, they were run for president without much emphasis upon a political platform. They were run basically as military heroes, which was in effect the attempt by the Whig Party to capitalize on what the opposition, the Democrats, had patented with Andrew Jackson. Well, William Henry Harrison was no Andrew Jackson. Plus, Jackson survived 2 terms, and William Henry Harrison barely lasted a month in office. Zachary Taylor, on the other hand, probably one of our most forgotten presidents, but that doesn't mean he's forgettable. Zachary Taylor is the closest thing to Andrew Jackson in the 19th century. He may have been in a different party. He considered himself like Eisenhower in some ways, almost to be above partisan politics. He was a Southern slaveholder, and so the South felt rather complacent about his election in 1848, figuring after all he's one of us. And as soon as he became president, he revealed himself to be much more than a Southern slaveholder. He was first and foremost a nationalist, like Andrew Jackson. And he made it very clear that just as Andrew Jackson had been willing to march an American army into his native South Carolina if South Carolina made any move toward secession, so Zachary Taylor basically said the same thing about Texas when it resisted attempts to bring New Mexico, much of which it claimed, into the Union as a free state. California would come into the Union as a free state if Zachary Taylor had his way. And in fact, Taylor was so decisive and so pronounced in his, let's face it, favoritism toward northern anti-slavery interests that the South convened a convention in Nashville, Tennessee in 1850, the purpose of which was to at least discuss secession. In other words, bringing on the Civil War a full decade before it actually happened. Well, before that could happen, fate intervened, and Zachary Taylor died after less than a year and a half in office. He died making it clear that he opposed what would become known as the Compromise of 1850. And it's long and it's complicated, but the fact is his successor, his vice president, took exactly the opposite view. And so because Zachary Taylor died when he did, A, he never marched an army into the South. B, he didn't stare the South down, if you will, over the expansion of slavery. Instead, his successor signed on to the Compromise of 1850. And whatever you think about that, it had the practical consequence of postponing the Civil War for a full decade, during which the North continued to evolve in terms of industry, in terms of railroad, basically being prepared for a war. And something else happened.
You might be off.
In the last 10 years, Abraham Lincoln emerged from obscurity.
Thanks, Richard, and I can hear you very well. I think our broadcast is going fantastic. After the Civil War, the period, Teddy Roosevelt emerges, and he has a very unique experience during his military service. Will you explain and describe that for us?
He does, and it's fascinating because he's preceded by William McKinley, who was the last Civil War soldier to be president, and who we vaguely associate today, because he tends to be overshadowed by TR, with the Spanish-American War. And ironically, McKinley, who was also a very devout Methodist, who took the lessons of the Bible to heart, was perhaps because of his experience, because of his first-hand experience in the Civil War, he was not a pacifist, but he was certainly a great champion of peace through diplomacy. And so when rebellious Cubans demanded freedom from Spanish rule, and many Americans took up their cause, and McKinley was sympathetic to that cause. But he didn't intend to go to war over it. And of course, eventually, there was a war. Remember, the USS Maine was blown up in Havana Harbor, and McKinley, in effect, was dragged almost against his will into a war, not to acquire territory, not to acquire Cuba, but to, in effect, liberate Cuba from Spanish rule. Okay. Teddy Roosevelt becomes a national hero in the course of what John Hay, the Secretary of State, called the Splendid Little War, barely 100 days long, which is how lopsided the military confrontation was between the United States and Spain in Cuba and in the Philippines. But here's the fascinating thing about TR. TR, of course, we all associate with San Juan Hill and the Rough Riders and charging up San Juan Hill. It made him a national hero, and then it made him governor of New York, which meant he was around to be McKinley's running mate in 1900, which meant he was in the room after McKinley died from an assassin's bullet, and he redefined the presidency in ways that unfortunately made most 20th century Americans tend to forget about William McKinley. But if you're a Freudian, and I'm not, but if you are, you can't look at TR and his bloodlust, some would say, whether on San Juan Hill or in the wilds of Africa, shooting big game. There's something in TR's past which just you can't overlook. His father, a great towering figure whom TR referred to as Greatheart, the character out of Pilgrim's Progress. His father had not fought in the Civil War. In fact, his father was one of many people, Grover Cleveland, by the way, would also do this, who paid for a substitute. The law at the time allowed, frankly, the wealthy, usually for $300, to buy a substitute, take their place. And Theodore Roosevelt Sr. Did that. Now, he rendered invaluable service with the U.S. Sanitary Commission and improved the lives of countless soldiers in ways that, again, the federal government did not take for its responsibility. But the fact of the matter is that his son was, and again, historians debate this, but it is reasonable to ask if some of his son's appetite for military conflict was grounded in feelings of almost shame, or at least the need to prove himself, to compensate, if you will, for the fact that his father, whom he adored and whom he emulated in a great many ways, had in this one respect, in effect, failed him.
Going back in time, can we return back to the Revolutionary War period? Can you tell us about the military experience of presidents who were some of our founding fathers?
Well, sure. Again, a president who is sort of widely, not forgotten, but overlooked, partly because of those who came before and after him, is James Monroe. There's a wonderful new biography, by the way, of Monroe out, which I would strongly recommend. He had an extraordinary career, beginning as a very young man. He was, I'm going to say, 18, 19 years old when he fought under Washington at the Battle of Trenton and Princeton, which, as you remember, crossing the Delaware. Well, Washington crossed the Delaware to fight on Christmas night in Trenton, and then a few days later to again surprise a Hessian army of British mercenaries, in effect, at nearby Trenton. And what that did, those two battles, not only prolonged the war, but in many ways turned the tide. It convinced a lot of doubting Americans that they could, in fact, stand up against the greatest army in the world. Well, Monroe was there. He was a significant part of both battles, and it in effect gave him a credential as part of the revolutionary generation. John Adams, of course, didn't fight except in the courtroom, arguing the case for revolution, and then subsequently as a great diplomat in Europe, obtaining support, critically needed financial support for the American cause. Jefferson was governor of Virginia during the Revolution, was widely criticized at the time, and even now there are those who criticize him for the lack of preparedness, and indeed his opponents at the time accused him of being a coward, of running away from the British Army. That's, like most such charges, a gross exaggeration, but it was something of a stain on Jefferson's record. Monroe, as I say, was an authentic revolutionary hero. And then John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams, was in effect the last of the revolutionary generation. And again, was a great diplomat who argued the American cause and who was really the kind of critical factor behind what became known as the Monroe Doctrine, which basically told Europe to keep its hands off this young republic and indeed the Western Hemisphere. So just as anyone who lived through the Civil War was branded politically and otherwise for the second half of the 19th century, so a whole generation of revolutionaries, whether or not they actually donned uniform and fought on the battlefield, they were defined by the time and by their experience.
Can you give us a sense or some examples of maybe some presidents that presided or maybe applied their military experience over as it relates to territorial expansion? So not so much
Sure.
declared war or civil war, but skirmishes that may have occurred as we pressed west.
Well, I mean, ironically, Jefferson, the least militaristic of early American presidents, who did the most to literally double the size of the country, and he did it not with a gun, but with a pen, and $15 million, borrowed dollars, by the way, with which he bought Louisiana from Napoleon. But Andrew Jackson, there's no doubt about it. One of the reasons why, at the time and since, critics of Jackson have tended to single him out as evidence of the dictatorial tendencies that can come with military success. Jackson made war on the Seminole Indians in Florida. He made war on the British at New Orleans. Well, as president, he made war on the Bank of the United States, and he threatened to make war on his home state of South Carolina if they pursued what they called nullification, the idea that if a state didn't like a federal law, in this case the tariff, the protectionist policies that were favored by northern industrialists, often at the expense of the South, that a state like South Carolina could on its own nullify or refuse to obey whatever law it didn't like. Well, to Jackson, this was the first step toward the dissolution of the Union. And he was very explicit publicly and privately about his willingness to march an army south if that's what it took. And at that point, Jackson was such an overawing figure. Nobody doubted, precisely because of his record, because of his fiery temperament. Nobody for a moment doubted that he meant what he said. And so it's a classic case where in the short term, Jackson's military training, if you will, and temperament served him very well. But it's interesting, 150, 200 years later, almost 200 years later, he's probably more controversial than he was at the time.
I have one more question, and then we'll turn it over to submitted questions from our virtual audience. Richard, if our audience wanted to go out and do some more research or do some further reading, are there any particular books or biographies that treat this subject, or specifically have good passages related to the military service of the presidents? Do you have any of those that you would recommend?
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, there are good biographies of now pretty much all of these presidents. And one of the really interesting things is the Gilded Age presidents, who for a long time were ignored. The great author Thomas Wolfe, not Tom Wolfe, the modern Tom Wolfe, but Thomas Wolfe, who wrote Look Home an Angel back in the 1930s. It was that Thomas Wolfe who famously wrote about the post-Civil War presidents, that they were what he called the lost Americans. You knew they all had beards, but you couldn't tell them apart, one from the other. Which one had the Burnside sideburns, which one had the full beard, et cetera, et cetera. They all kind of swam together. And one consequence of that is, for a long time, biographers and historians tended to write them off. James Garfield, who of course wasn't president very long, but who had an impressive record in the Civil War. And in fact, in the middle of the war, Garfield had become a general, and the people in his congressional district in Ohio, on their own, elected him to Congress. And Lincoln said there are plenty of brigadier generals, but there aren't enough good congressmen. And at Lincoln's insistence, Garfield went to Congress, and it was from there that he was eventually elected to the presidency in 1880. And there are a couple really good, Candace Millard, I believe is the name, and of course the name of the book escapes me at the moment, but Destiny of the Republic, I believe, is the name of it. Wonderful biography of Garfield, which of course, in the nature of things, also covers the war and other presidents and political figures as well. William McKinley has been rediscovered. Robert Mary wrote a marvelous book called just President McKinley. And I guarantee you, I often refer to McKinley as the most important president you've never heard of, or probably know virtually nothing about. Fascinating life in and out of uniform, and what it taught him, in effect, and what kind of president it made him. Ironically, the war-hating McKinley would be the founder of the American Empire. Before he was gunned down in 1901, the United States would add Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines, among other places. He had already annexed Hawaii in his first term before the Spanish-American War. So McKinley was a great expansionist, but he just wanted to do it, if possible, peacefully.
Okay, we have a question from the audience, and this question is near and dear to our heart and a bit of a field of the time period that we're talking in, Richard, but I think you'll enjoy answering this question. Talking about Senator Dole and our own Senator Dole and how he might have drawn on his military experience during his political runs for president, or how did he take advantage of what he learned during his military experience? And
it
then
is
we'll return to the
so,
time period.
yeah, well, no, it is so central to his life, and I think to understanding, even at this phase, his legacy. I mean, I remember hearing him say that he only wanted one word on his grave, which was Bob Dole veteran. He defined himself in many ways, not as a politician or as a would-be president or even a member of the Senate, as much as he loved that institution. But it was his time in uniform, and it was the bonds that he developed, and I think maintained really for the rest of his life. I know undoubtedly many of those who are watching tonight are familiar with, really as long as he was physically able. He would on weekends go down to the World War II Memorial, which by the way might very well not be there had he not accepted Bill Clinton's invitation at a critical moment right after the 1996 campaign to step in and in effect take over the fundraising, which was lagging. And but I think beyond that, and it's also interesting, Bob Dole was a transactional politician. What do I mean by that? He wasn't one for great overarching visions, and he took some heat for that. Uh, he had been a constituent politician, and by that I mean he was in office to do things for individuals. Constituent service on a continental scale, if you can imagine. And I know, really, again, for the rest of his life, he didn't talk about it much, but among friends, he would acknowledge, I think with some feelings of pride, he tried to do something to help at least one person every day. Usually, someone lost in the government bureaucracy, and almost all the time, it was a fellow veteran. And I think, that in some ways suggests the kind of president he would have been. A transactional figure in a lot of ways, someone working as closely as he could with Congress, taking advantage very practically of the connections, the friendships, the trust that he enjoyed on both sides of the aisle. He was, needless to say, a, a fervent anti-communist. Um, he was a Cold Warrior um, throughout the 60s and into the 70s. He was at the same time supportive of Richard Nixon's efforts to try to ease tensions with the Soviet Union and to reach out to what used to be called Red China. Um, but he was a practical diplomat as well. So, I think his experience in uniform. Well, for another example, one reason why he was not reflexively anti-government, as I think some perhaps some conservatives are. He was certainly conservative, and he was certainly a traditional Midwest fiscal conservative. But he never forgot that after he'd been wounded and in effect left for dead on a foreign battlefield, that it was the federal government that nursed him back to health. He never forgot that it was the GI Bill of Rights that made it possible for him to, in effect, resume the college education that had begun at KU and was so rudely and brutally interrupted. So he had a complex view. He had, I think, what you call healthy skepticism about the social engineering aspects, if you will, of modern government. But he was well aware of, again, in a very practical, personalized way, because he had benefited from government health care and from the classroom education that government had made possible. he wanted to make sure that those same opportunities were available to other people, particularly people who started life on the lower rung of the economic ladder.
Richard, you told us some great anecdotes about Zachary Taylor and James Monroe. What other presidents during this period of the 19th century would you want to touch on in this session? You know, talking about, again, their military engagements and how they took that into their presidency.
Well, you know, there's some strange, to show you how desperate in some ways professional politicians were to have the aura of military service. Taylor, as I said, died in 1850. Now, when Fillmore succeeded in 1852, the Whig Party, Fillmore's party, Taylor's party, had decided they really had enough of Fillmore after 2 years. So they nominated a general, a great, big, ponderous, somewhat pompous figure, Winfield Scott, who was an authentic military hero and a very powerful military leader and strategist in his time, going back to the War of 1812. This is 1852, so you can do the math. 40 years on, he's a bit long in the tooth. Well, the Democrats, not to be outdone, looked high and low. Well, they didn't have any obvious heroes from the Mexican-American War, so they took the next best thing. Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire, who had had a somewhat checkered military career. His opponents insisted that he fainted in the middle of one battle. They claimed that he was the hero of many a well-fought battle, which suggests just how we did not invent vicious politics. Negative campaigning has been with us. So anyway, in 1852, you had the battle of the sort of second raters. But the one thing you had in common was they had both worn the uniform. And it among other things, it reminds us how incredibly persistent was the example of Andrew Jackson. Jackson had been in his grave for 7 years now, but it was still very much what Arthur Schlesinger called the age of Jackson. And in fact, the age of Jackson arguably lasted until 1861, when Abraham Lincoln, newly inaugurated, confronting a genuine revolution, far greater, more ominous than anything Jackson faced, nevertheless cited the example of Andrew Jackson, a Democrat, where Lincoln was a Republican, but someone who everyone, even then, 30 years after he left office, understood was synonymous with a nationalist outlook and a resistance to Southern secessionists.
I have one more question from our virtual audience. Richard, this person wants to know about Abraham Lincoln, and did he have any specific military experience before he was the president, and did he take that into his presidency?
A great question. He had very limited experience. Indeed, Lincoln, as was his wont, tended to make jokes about his military experience. I won't say he fought. He was enlisted for 2 months in a sort of serial comic frontier conflict known as the Black Hawk Indian War in rural Illinois. On the other hand, Lincoln did say the thing in his life that probably meant the most to him, I think even more than being elected president of the United States, was the fact that he was elected by his fellow soldiers to be their captain. And that was about the most glorious thing that he did. As he said, he bled frequently from mosquito bites, but that was about the roughest carnage that he encountered during the Black Hawk War. And by the way, why was he making fun of himself? Well, because Lincoln had a very sharp tongue, and sometimes got him in trouble, particularly as a young man. Sharp sense of humor, and a great gift for satire. And he turned it against opposing politicians. In this case, in 1848, General Lewis Cass. Once again, you had the Whigs running General Zachary Taylor. The Democrats ran General Lewis Cass, whose claims to military distinction were pretty thin, and so much so that Lincoln worked up a set piece for the stump in which he ridiculed his own military background by way of ridiculing General Cass's claims to military service.
Richard, thank you so much for being with us this evening. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine, Audrey. Thank you. And good luck for the rest of the series.
Thank you. All of you out there joining us in our virtual audience, put February 24th, 2 weeks from today, at 7 p.m. on your calendar, or you can catch it on our YouTube channel later on. But you won't want to miss the live interview with Director Kurt Graham and Mark Adams from the Truman Library and Museum when we talk about the life and career and military service of President Harry Truman. Don't miss it.
Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for our program this evening. If you are a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Refer to doleinstitute.org for up-to-date information on all of our upcoming events. We hope you enjoyed this evening's program. Thank you and good night.